Awesome. I think we can get started. Pretty much everyone has joined. So just to say hi to everyone again and welcome everyone again. This is Panos, co-founder of PNOE, and today Don is joining me. Don has been a PNOE user for quite some time and has structured his business around many innovative health technologies, including PNOE. And today we're going to be discussing how he is using PNOE in combination with other modalities to provide more personalized and effective nutrition and training regimens for his clients. So, hi, Don. Thank you for joining me here today.
Hi, Panos.
Yeah.
It's been really fun to integrate
Mm-hmm.
the PNOE and VO2 Max into our patient experiences,
Mm-hmm.
have them do that. And so I'll give a little background. So I'm a physician and medical director with MOOV Health. We're a organization that focuses in a consumer-facing way with health, and we focus on metabolic health. And we put into practice a really great practice of bringing our patients in, where all of our patients that come in for our clinic and all of our clients, they get a PNOE VO2 Max. And we do a resting metabolic rate on some of them, but really we focus on that VO2 max for them because they're coming in because they're metabolically unhealthy or they want to be metabolically optimized. And people are like, well, what does that mean? That means that they want fat loss, they want less inflammation in their body, they want to retain their muscle mass and grow their muscle mass while they increase their overall health, right? They want their cortisol levels to normalize. They want to have that anti-aging and less oxidation. And we found that utilizing a calculation wasn't effective. We were having people overtrained and their cortisol testosterone ratios were narrowing up because they were overtraining and they weren't getting real zone 2. And when we started doing zone 2 training, especially in our most metabolically unhealthy, so the guy who's 5'7", 270 pounds, what is that in kilos? 135, 132 kilos, right? That's someone who is really out of shape. I can't tell them to go to the gym and start running to lose weight. I mean, their knees hurt if they jog. And so we wanted to overcome some of these barriers that people had for getting healthy. And so we do a comprehensive laboratory panel, we do bioimpedance scanning, and then that VO2 max. And then we sit and consult with them and we go over their goals and we come up with a way for them to be able to get healthy. And what we see is by adding that zone 2, these people are able to change their lives. And in 3 to 6 months, they're completely different, completely different. And it makes just a massive difference in what we see with them.
No, this is a great introduction, Don. So, do you mind also giving us a little bit of background around your practice? So, what was the motivation behind starting the practice? What is the orientation of the practice in terms of the audience you're catering to? What makes you different? And in general, what is your plan moving forward? Just so that people can, because there's a lot of different, types of health businesses opening up out there.
Right.
So I think it's useful for people to understand where you're going with it.
Yeah. So, personally, I'm an emergency medicine, traditionally trained physician who then has done fellowship training for metabolic health, anti-aging, longevity, and hormones. And I was approached by our partnership to help build this new way to treat and take care of people. And, my background also, I was in the Navy and assigned to the Marine Corps. And so I saw the difference that it made for regular exercise, good nutritional intake, and overall having a better, more healthy approach and being optimized. From a business standpoint and from a health standpoint, we wanted to see what was the best things that we could do for our patients, for our clients that are coming in the door. And the American Heart Association in 2016 published a landmark paper where it called VO2 max should be another vital sign. And we should be using it all throughout medicine. And probably we should be using it at every training level that we're doing. So if you're in the gym with your trainer and they're giving you guidance on how to be best healthy, we should be looking at your VO2 max to figure out how do we increase that so we can decrease your all-cause mortality, and how do we tell you what your zones are so that you can train in the appropriate zone. I have people whose calculated zone 2, low end of zone 2 for them is 134 beats per minute, and we test them and it's 103, right? That's a massive swing on where they need to be. And so overall, we're trying to bring this to as many people as we can across the nation. Now, we're setting up multiple clinics, and we like this intake process because it's so valuable for the patients. And they're by using the VO2 max to establish that base for their zone 2 training, they're able to build a base before we even start doing the zone 4 or VO2 max increase. And what we're seeing in general, and this is anecdotal, 25 to 50 patients, maybe 100 patients now, where I have good data, is that in 3 to 6 months, actually about the 6-month mark of just baseline zone 2 training, I take someone who's metabolically unhealthy, VO2 maxes less than 30, and we're increasing them into the 30s, or having more than a 20% increase in their VO2 max just by regular zone 2 training. And so I see the power and benefit of being able to guide these clients to make their workout super efficient and to make the time that they're putting in towards their health really have a positive outcome.
This is very interesting, and what I would like to highlight for listeners here is that traditionally clinics like the one Don is running would focus on the resting metabolic test initially, because there's this misconception that the active test is something that is only for athletes, or the active test is something that the average person who's metabolically impaired wouldn't be able to perform. And overall it's just not something that is appropriate for these people. But it's first of all based on all the existing literature and some of the things that I will share down the conversation. This is absolutely not true, but what Don is telling us and what he has been able to prove is that it is also something that is practically possible, and not just possible, but very beneficial for the health outcomes that he is looking to attain.
Yeah, and like you said, how do you implement it? That was one of the barriers that we had. Initially I was doing some of the testing, and I'm like, wow, that's an efficient use of physician time, right? Just to be honest, how much you need to pay a physician per hour to do things, that's just inefficient. And so we trained up intake professionals. That's what they are. They're either a medical assistant or a trainer or somebody with some background that can give them the screening questions, make sure it's safe for them to get there, and then the patient will help us choose, or the client will help us choose, do we put them on a treadmill or do we put them on a bike? And so we have a treadmill and a bike in our facility that we put people on. And so the guy who's 9 months out of recovery from his bad Liz Frank fracture in his foot, he went on the bike and he did great. Other people, we're able to tailor the VO2 max test. You don't have to run like a Spartan on the treadmill to get a good VO2 max test. We do it walking an incline with some people, because what we're trying to do is see that metabolic health at that level. And so now that we have that intake professional, my intake process, allows us to have the intake professional get them signed up for labs, do their VO2 max testing, and do their bioimpedance scan, and then they come back and see me in a couple of weeks when everything's back. And we're able to really tailor a plan for them. And so I think that we have to get innovative in how we utilize these things. And, it was so great to work with you, Panos, because you were able to provide the support so that we could train our intake professionals. And when they had questions, or when there was issues, like we had this poor guy who was, 350 pounds, and he passed his ventilatory threshold 1 from going from sitting to walking to the bike, and I got a phone call almost immediately after the test was done. Hey, is this right? He's so metabolically unhealthy. I've never seen this. And we were like, no, it's right. And so then we talked about how we would navigate all of that output from that and how we would make good choices for him. So that support also is really important. I think if I was using a different platform without the support that you offered, it would have made it a lot harder to integrate all of this. Like if I had bought a different system where they're like, okay, you buy the system and you have to be the expert. I didn't feel the need to be the expert. I had all these experts who were holding me up and helping me build that.
Well, and thank you so much for saying that because, it is a very big part of what we offer here at PNOE. We started by making the device smaller, cheaper, easier to use, but, this is just step one. Cardiometabolic testing, as I will discuss, provides a boatload of data and being able to make sense out of all of this information provided to you, and then also being able to use it in a way that will enable you to prescribe nutrition and training or other interventions for your clients. This is something that requires time, requires expertise, and if you don't provide that as a package, then most likely what you will do as a company is you will sell a piece of hardware that is going to sit in a closet. But what I would also like to highlight in what Don said is that VO2 Max testing doesn't have to be a true max test in order to be valuable for the practice and the patient. Most of the information that is truly important when it comes to prescribing nutrition, training, or other interventions is coming from the sub-max part of the test, and actually the initial part of the test where the person is starting to move and is in this light to moderate intensity exercise spectrum. Because this is where you see all the big changes happening in fuel utilization. This is where you see the existence or non-existence of overcompensatory breathing response and so on and so forth. And this is what is actually telling you whether you have a metabolic, a cardiovascular, or a pulmonary limitation. So again, this is another point that we need to highlight to people. You don't need to kill someone in order to get the value out of a VO2 Max test. And this is what makes it something that is practical and possible for the average Joe who is metabolically inefficient.
Yeah, we have so many people who are trying to get healthy that are like perimenopausal, menopausal women, older men, and all the way down to the very young. And it's so insightful and so helpful for them to come in and get that testing so that we can tailor up everything. If you don't mind me showing, I'll show some of the results.
100%. Yeah.
This is since July. We have this scanning data, and this is our bioimpedance scanner. And you can see here, you have 104 pounds of weight loss since July, 117 pounds of fat loss, and 64 pounds of muscle gain over baseline. And so what we've been able to do is help people maximize their ability to improve and to get the results that they want. They don't want to be losing muscle. They want to be losing that fat. They want to be feeling better. And that's what's been really, really fun about using this, is just seeing the difference. And you can tell when you do their consult, you can ask them, hey, it didn't go as well this month. How was your zone 2 training going? Oh, well, doc, I got real busy or whatever. And then, you can help them realize, okay, well, get back on it. It'll make a big improvement if you just get back on and start doing this. And it doesn't have to be onerous. They don't have to be doing an hour of zone 2 training every day. We focus on trying to get 30 to 40-minute blocks in based on the research, right? Of what it takes to activate that SIRT1 pathway, that AMPK pathway, so that you can get that fat metabolism going and get those positive downstream effects, upregulate your insulin receptors, and really help people kind of change the metabolism in their body.
100%. And, based on what you just described, Don, I think what's very interesting to highlight here, which is something that we see across, the thousands of affiliates who use PNOE today, is that one of the reasons why PNOE is not just a tool that allows you to prescribe more accurately, but also an engagement tool, is because it breaks down things in a way that are understandable by the end consumer when it comes to how their biology works. So you can think of the PNOE consult, whether one of our experts does it or we train your staff to do it, like doesn't matter. Like the end result of the consult is almost like a very small course on biology 101, focusing on the core things that keep you alive and determine whether you're going to get sick and die early, or on the vice versa, live a long and healthy life. And what we've seen is that when you take someone through this mini course on biology 101, things start to make sense. I now know why I need to do resistance training, because I understand that, this particular system is going to be positively affected by resistance training, and I need the system in order to have XYZ in my health. Or zone 2 training is important for my mitochondria, and I now know how my mitochondria fits into the broader picture. And that's why I will now do my zone 2 training, or I have at least much higher chances of adhering to my zone 2 regimen, because I understand why it needs to be there. I'm a big believer in the fact that we're not facing a pathological lack of willpower. I think it's more of an educational awareness issue, and overall, explaining to people why they need to do what we're asking them to do.
Right. Do you have a sample of one of the reports that you can share?
Yeah, 100%. So what I was going to do.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
if we have time, I explain this one page to our client. That zone 2 breakdown with the fat metabolism, and it's so insightful because you often hear people who are struggling with their weight loss, like, doc, I go to the gym all the time, I've cleaned up my diet and so on, and they get on the elliptical and they get their heart rate up to 160 and they keep it at 160 for 45 minutes to an hour. And they're like, why am I not losing weight? And I'm like, well, because you didn't do the right thing to lose the fat. You didn't do the right thing to be able to shed those pounds that you wanted. You burned glucose for 45 minutes to an hour. You didn't burn fat, which was your goal. And let's see how we can tailor your elliptical workout. So, because you enjoy doing that, let's see how we can tailor it to make it way more efficient for you and to get to your goals. And sure enough, they do that, and they're 2 pounds a week, just clipping it off. And they're like, wow, this is amazing, doc. I didn't realize, less effort would result in more benefit. So,
sure. So let me do this. Let me share my screen. I have a short presentation that kind of covers the basic science behind PNOE. So 1 second. Awesome. So for those who are not very familiar with metabolic testing and breath analysis, let's start with the very basics, which is, what are we actually tracking? There's 3 sensors that go into any clinical grade cardiometabolic analyzer, and these are a flow sensor. This is what sits in the mask. It measures volume of air coming in and out. You have a CO2 sensor, and you have an oxygen sensor that measure concentration of CO2 and O2 in inhalation and exhalation. What you see here is a waveform of how these 3 signals oscillate as you're breathing in and out. Now, there's a lot of analysis that goes into these 3 signals. And what the result of this analysis is 23 biomarkers that relate to different things of your biology. And some of these biomarkers are quite famous, like VO2 max and metabolic rate, but there is a lot more to it. For instance, we have biomarkers such as VE over VCO2, right, which shows us how effective your cardiorespiratory system is in discharging CO2 during exhalation. And we also have things like fat and carbohydrate oxidation, which is the a premise on which we build the training zones. And the programming that Don has been talking about. And so overall, by calculating all of these 23 biomarkers, you can group them in different categories, and then each category of biomarkers effectively becomes a picture of the health of one of the systems that you see in this picture. What's very important to point out is that the beauty of breath analysis is that it provides you the best combination of diagnostic specificity and diagnostic spectrum. So you do a test that covers all of these systems. All of them are very critical for our biology. But the beauty also is that it does so without requiring any sort of lab work, specimen collection, and as a result, it ends up being something very cheap and practical for the clinic. So overall, the experience is pretty much what we've been discussing. A 10-minute test if you're doing 7 to 10 minutes, if you're doing the resting test, and another 10, and in some cases 10 to 12 minutes if you're doing the exercise test. And we get the data over the cloud, we analyze it, and very soon we'll also open up our system to be interoperable with other diagnostic modalities you may be implementing in your practice, like blood work, body composition, and etc. And now going into what goes into the report, and very soon we're going to go into the training zones part. The most powerful hook that we have in our report is the biological age clock, is what a lot of people start to use in order to understand whether they're headed in the right direction. We use VO2 Max in order to calculate your biological age. And the benefits of that is that, first of all, it is probably the best indicator of your biological age because it has the most amount of scientific literature behind it as to its ability to measure risk of mortality and morbidity. By the way, biological age is just a very fancy term of describing risk of mortality and morbidity over the next 10 years. And if you look at the clinical literature, VO2 Max is the most well-studied variable in this capacity. We look at things like your metabolic rate, how faster or slower it is, and then compare what it should be. And this is particularly important if you're dealing with people that are going through medical weight loss, for example, getting GLP-1 shots, or if they're just going through normal weight loss, right? There's a lot of things that can impact your energy homeostasis, hormonal imbalances, being in perimenopause, menopause. And so understanding if your energy homeostasis has been impacted is very critical because that is going to regulate and dictate what you have to do in terms of nutrition and training. We measure fat and carbohydrate oxidation, and by doing so, we can dictate what your optimal fat, carbohydrate, and protein intake should look like. And also, because we look at how your cells, your heart, and your lungs are performing, we can prescribe the optimal breakdown between resistance, interval, and endurance training, because each one of these types of training is going to impact our different biological systems differently. So understanding where your limitation is going to dictate how you need to structure your training program in terms of these three variables. And going into the training zone component to pretty much the conversation we were having earlier with Dawn, when we measure fat and carbohydrate oxidation during a graded test, right, we can pretty much see how fat and carbohydrate utilization are evolving, right? And this is not this is not like a real chart. It's actually a representation of how fat and carbohydrate oxidation would look like for any person. And truly what matters here is that, there is obviously a negative trend for fat and a positive trend for carbohydrates. Every person is going to go through that. And depending on how these trends are, the optimal zones for your training will change. And this is pretty much what Don has been describing all along about his programming. And something also very important that I need to highlight is When it comes to integrating with the services of your business, something that we do provide, which is a very important component in how we help your business, is you can bring in all of the different biooptimization services, IV therapies, and supplements that you are providing in your business. And we do the matching with the different biological areas that we assess. And so if we find a deficiency somewhere, we will recommend a specific either biooptimization service or supplement or IV. And you can all understand why that becomes very important for the business, because we are utilizing our test in order to funnel people into the different modalities and supplements and IVs you're offering. And that turns the test into one of the biggest funneling mechanisms for your business at large. Something else that I would like to point out, which is actually from a presentation that another valued affiliate did a few months ago. His name is Leonard Pastrana from New BioAge. Don is also very familiar, and I think also friends with Leonard. What we're seeing here is this concept of using the crossover point as a marker for evaluating whether someone is metabolically impaired or not. What you see here is actual data of this fat and carbohydrate trend among 3 different types of people. At the very bottom, you have a very metabolically impaired person, and you see that the fat and carbohydrate oxidation crossover point occurs very, very early on. As a matter of fact, fat is never above carbs. And that means that this person can never go into the fat burning zone. We're talking about a person very similar to the one that Don was describing earlier, who was like, this person just got up from his chair and went into glucose mode. That is, very, very bad metabolic response. And then you have someone who's like doing okay, like, is perhaps active here and there. And there is a little bit of, positive crossover point in the sense that it doesn't occur right away, but it occurs, fairly early on in the exercise intensity spectrum, about 180 watts. And then you have someone who's like metabolically sensitive. His cells are super capable of utilizing fat as a fuel source because this person has very high mitochondrial density, meaning that his cells can continue to utilize fat as a fuel source, even though he's exercising and operating at very high power outputs and exercise intensities. In fact, this person's crossover point occurs at 300 watts, which is a very, very high power output on the bicycle. And so that alone just tells you how this simple concept of fat oxidation is perhaps the most important, reliable, and also easy to acquire marker for whether someone is metabolically healthy or not. This is just a short overview of a case study of a client that Leonard Pastrana dealt with. We all know that COVID also has very wide and impactful metabolic implications. We've seen that across millions of people now in the United States. And this is the case of a person who was metabolically okay. He had a VO2 max of 45, zone 2 that ranged from 103 to 116, and a fat max of 103. He went down with COVID and then had long COVID, and look at what happened to his VO2 max, his zone 2, and his fat max. But then Leonard put him on a zone 2 training, coupled with GLP-1 treatments and some other peptides. And in a matter of, days, weeks, he was able to very, very rapidly ramp up his metrics to almost where they were before he contracted COVID and went into the long COVID territory. So that's pretty much an overview on my end, just so that people can have a very good understanding of what comes out of the device and the report and the metrics that we deal with. Don, I don't know if you have anything that you would like to,
Yeah, I love these studies, and Leonard is really a thought leader in the metabolic health area, and I love discussing with him and his team about what peptides to use and what supplements to use to get people back to their health. They've been an amazing resource over at New BioAge, fantastic. And we're seeing the same things, that when we metabolically optimize people and help push them in the right direction, it's amazing. I will say one thing: when you dive into this literature, you put up the resistance, interval, and endurance as your three. Be really careful when you evaluate the literature, because they'll sometimes call things endurance training that are not. There's a fantastic study by Shakiri et al. in 2012 that shows that if you do resistance training, you increase or widen out your testosterone cortisol ratio. But then if you do what they called endurance training, you narrow that up. But you can decrease the narrowing by adding resistance training. And it was interesting because when you dive into their study, their endurance training, what they called endurance training, was starting at 75% max heart rate for 30 to 40 minutes, 3 times a week. And I wouldn't
which
call
is
that,
a very high, that's very high intensity for
right.
the average person.
And then they ramped up to 75 and 80% in the next 3 weeks. They did 4 weeks and then 4 weeks and 4 weeks. So at the end, they ended training in the 85%, which would be zone 4.
That's more like threshold training or
exactly.
FTP training. Yeah.
But they called it endurance training in the literature. So when you dive into this space, just be really careful and understand what you're talking about. What Panos and I are talking about is zone 2 training is endurance training.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's guided on that rate. Yeah.
And
So
in all of the programming that we provide, because as a company, we also do like full-blown exercise programming and nutrition programming through our Ds that, are dedicated to your business. So in our nomenclature, when it comes to exercise programming, resistance training has has hypertrophy and strength training as two distinct components. How much of each one you do is going to depend on A, your needs, and B, your goals. Interval training is going to be, going from recovery zone, which is zone 1 or zone 2, all the way up to either zone 4 or zone 5. Again, that is going to depend on your goals and your needs. And then we have the endurance component, which is basically zone 2. We can, call it, there's thoughts of completely changing that in the report and just calling it zone 2, because some people think that, oh, there can be something else besides zone 2. No, endurance training is exclusively zone 2, whatever the zone 2 of the person is.
Right. And you may take, instead of doing that HIIT interval at 20% of the time or 10% of the time, you may change that, like I do with some of my running athletes, and I put them at race pace, which should really be zone 3 for them. That should be their race pace output, so they can sustain it for their 10K, or 20K, because that's what we're trying to do for them, is build up that zone 3 over time so that they can sustain that kind of middle zone. So they're past zone 2, but they're not maxing out. And so, you can utilize all of these things to really dial it in. The point is, dial it in for the client to help the client hit their needs and their goals in a really, really specific and efficient way.
And I'm very glad you brought up this point about zone 3. Zone 3 is the dead zone, in the sense that you don't really use it to train. You're not getting any real adaptations from zone 3. You can get adaptations from zone 2. You can get adaptations from interval zone 4 or interval zone 5. You can get adaptations from threshold training, which is like constant, FTP performance at zone 4. But zone 3, which is where you perform during the race, is something that you save it for the race, or you save it for the few times that you're actually rehearsing. your race.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's why we'll put together these specific plans for like maybe only once a month, right? We're
Yeah,
doing a race pace to
exactly.
figure
Yeah.
out where
Yeah.
they're at and what else do we need to
Mhm.
do. And
And
that's it's so insightful to the athlete or to the
mhm,
client. And some of
mhm,
these people that I'm calling athletes, they're a 45-year-old guy who wants to run,
mhm,
who wants to qualify for the Boston Marathon or something.
mm, mm,
We get them there. They're
yeah.
just a normal everyday guy.
Yeah, and since we're bringing up the cortisol component, by the way, here in San Antonio, Texas, the A4M Women's Health Summit, Sarah Gottfried is going to be giving a talk as well. I'm a very big follower. I've read her book, The Hormone Cure. Highly recommended to everyone that is dealing with hormones, especially women. And she talks a lot about overtraining and cortisol oversecretion. And I just want to highlight how this concept of like zone 2 versus zone 3 is so critical about cortisol oversecretion. And zone 3 is a very big black hole for the everyday person who has taken up training a little bit more seriously, including myself, because when we go out and we want to run and blow steam off, like we have this innate tendency to just push it a little bit harder, because we want to get the endorphins, because we're listening to music, because we want to have fun, because we're also doing it for psychological reasons, right? We're not just doing it for health optimization. But the problem is that when you're going into zone 3, if you look at what happens in your fuel utilization, you lose so much fat burning process, and you ramp up glucose metabolism so much compared to zone 2 that you end up overstressing your system. That leads to cortisol oversecretion, and you have all of these, cascade of negative repercussions afterwards, which may not be so evident if you're younger, but when you go into the perimenopause and menopause, period, then obviously these become quite significant. So just wanted to highlight that also from personal experience.
And it's quite amazing what you can do to help people's cortisol levels by
Yeah.
just focusing on that zone 2 training and getting them back. And they start feeling different. They start sleeping different. Their waking feels different to them.
Mhm,
And that's because it is different downstream.
mhm,
We've
mhm,
improved everything.
mhm, mhm,
And so that it's fantastic. The other thing I wanted to point out, we did this the other day in clinic, is
mhm,
we had someone who's very well athletically trained. I think she got like a 47 or a 50 on her VO2 max. So
mhm,
fantastic.
mhm,
And I wanted to show when she had her crossover, and of course, at the end of VO2 max, you're all carbohydrate burning. You're just in that
mhm,
carbohydrate zone. And I wanted to show her how long it took for her to start coming back down. And she had to recover once she hit that high zone and had been there for over a minute. It takes so long. It took her 8 minutes to come down back into her threshold. So there was any significant amount of fat burning. And what I've utilized that graph to show people is that even one session where you're 2 to 3 minutes in zone 4, essentially the rest of the time that you're spending exercising, it's going to be very hard for you to flip your metabolism back to fat burning. That one episode, and that discipline that you have to have
yeah.
in keeping zone 2, or have some type of monitor so you're monitoring it
Mhm,
and letting yourself know, I think is
mhm,
really important, because it takes
mhm,
so long for our mitochondria to flip back to that
mhm.
fat burning metabolism relative to the time it took to get there.
Definitely. And something else that people have to really be mindful about is exercise timing. So everything that we're describing now becomes super critical if we're dealing with someone who has cortisol dysregulation, because as we all know, cortisol is something that goes up and down. It is supposed to go up in the beginning of the day, and it's supposed to go down later in the day. So if you're having these events that are cortisol oversecretion events, then you are creating a stimulus for your cortisol to dysregulate in the wrong way. And by the way, whoever is doing cortisol testing, doing this one-off cortisol measurement in the middle of the day means nothing. You actually need to see how your cortisol evolves by doing at least 5 or 6, and some people say 10, measurements throughout the day. But you can understand that if the optimal cortisol curve is, a peak, a rise, and a peak at some point around noon, and then, a slowly but steady decrease throughout the rest of the day until you go to bed. If all of a sudden you create an event around 5 or 6 p.m. where you, boom, secrete a lot of cortisol in the system, that is going to create, many problems, including, having difficulty sleeping, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. Spiking your cortisol right before bed is we call that suboptimal for sure.
Yeah.
So it is really important. And doing those tests are very insightful because a random cortisol level, it's just what it is. It's random.
Yeah. Awesome. So, Dawn, thank you so much for, covering all of these great insights in this discussion. I'm sure people have questions. The best way to deal with them, whether they're like business related questions or, educational related questions, is if people schedule to do a call with one of our reps. Business development reps. My team just posted on the chat a link that you guys can use in order to schedule some time with us. And if anyone who may be interested in this conversation, we will be publishing this webinar online, and it will be available on YouTube, so you can share the link and spread the word. Yeah, whoever is interested in learning more, they can schedule some time with us through the link that we just posted on the chat. And other than that, Dawn, I would like to thank you for taking the time to join me here today in this lovely conversation. And we look forward to hearing more from your incredible health outcomes that you are generating for your patients.
Yeah, thanks, Panos. It was great to talk with you, and thanks for helping us out.
Of course. It's a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye.